This is Father Jacob Bertrand Janczyk.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Bonaventure, that was a very emphatic this.
I love our new intro thing. I wonder if our people are attentive to this. We've changed our intro thing to conform to best practices or industry standards or what have you, and it's
probably best practices from like 2 months ago because we're a little behind the curve. But we're Dominicans. That's what we do.
It's totally okay. We're still wearing the same thing we wore 800 years ago. Not the same exact identity versus
maybe.
Okay. Maybe, yeah. Who knows? We just actually, yes. All of our habits are passed down from the beginning of the order
from Saint Dominic.
Wouldn't that be cool?
No.
I mean, it would be impossible just physically, but it'd be neat to. I've always thought like passing rosaries down because some of us have rosaries that are from older friars.
Yeah,
but like to pass down habits. Yeah. Anyway, what I like about the new, so we have that new intro thing, and it's kind of like this is NPR, like the kind of I always think about how NPR has a certain like cadence and how they speak on NPR radio shows and things like this. Like wait, don't tell me. They have this. They always end with "This is NPR," and I always think that's kind of like it's just like a experience I have with this. So I'm always excited to emphasize different demonstratives. You could say demonstrative pronouns or whatever.
Yeah, I'm certainly in no place to criticize NPR and how they handle their intro and outro bumpers because NPR versus Godsplaining, I think they probably have us on like street cred, so fine. But I don't know how you would fit on NPR. Like your voice is too enthusiastic to be an NPR kind of person.
That's true. Yeah. They have like in England, there's the BBC accent, although they've changed it a bit. You have things, but NPR has its own cadences to things.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe we should do an NPR like episode where we all speak as if we're on NPR or something, and that would be so bizarre. Yeah. No, we're just too excited, I think. Dominicans we're excited about stuff, especially when we see our friends, and Father Jacob Bertrand is my dear friend.
How kind.
You're welcome. To no return, folks. No return. Just an acceptance. That's fair.
Thank you. Hilarious. Well, before we get caught in more personal dynamics here, just kidding. Father Bonaventure is my friend too.
That's why they tune in. They want to see this kind of back and forth business. All right.
Maybe. Okay. Well, speaking of friends and people, that's a terrible transition, but it's what we're going to go with. We are going to talk today not about our personal relationships with one another, but about a different question, whether or not people are good. Are people good? I think when maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Like when we were taught how to like preach and how not to preach in our homiletics or preaching courses, we're always taught like, don't talk about the preparation for things because people don't care. But this isn't a homily. So like, I think when I hear a homily of like, yesterday when I was looking at the readings, and it's like, oh my gosh, but whatever, I'm going to do it for this because it's not a homily. But when we were talking about this topic first, I think the suggested title was "People Aren't Good," or it's more declarative.
Yeah,
I don't remember for sure, but we've turned it into a question to be more optimistic.
Yeah, that's fair.
Not sure we're going to be more optimistic, but the question: Are people good? Is what we're going to talk about. Are we as human beings post fall? We'll at least bracket our conversation not to Adam and Eve, but to post Adam and Eve, the fallen condition, even in the context of the new covenant, post resurrection. Are people good? Are we good, or are we corrupted? Are we able to pursue the good? I guess is also a question, right? Like, are we able to chase after the good with ways that are in ways that actually make us good or not? So that's what we're going to talk about. Are people good? Whatever. There's I guess I watched a trailer. I think Father Bonaventure has been a bit more invested in this, but there's this TV show. Is it Netflix? It's Netflix, right? I watched the trailer on YouTube, so I don't know exactly what plot. It's Netflix. There's a TV show, relatively new, has a few seasons, relatively new, called The Good Place. And from what I gathered from the trailer, it's about what's the actress's name? Do you remember?
Christine Bell. From Kristen Bell from Frozen. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I don't think she was in Frozen. I think that was an animated. Yeah.
Wait, that wasn't her?
Okay.
Frozen's animated?
But making a joke. Ooh, gosh. But so the premise is right that she dies and she ends up going to heaven, but she was supposed to go to hell, the bad
Yeah,
place, but she's in the good place. So it's a kind of like, oh, what's going on here? Reconciling that. I don't know. Tell us more about this or
sure.
why we're talking even about it.
Yeah, so some people might. So I do some philosophy on my spare time. I'm working on this large, I'm working on an article, you could say, from for years, in philosophy. And so people always recommend, oh, well, you might like X, and that's almost never true. That X is almost whatever they offer me is almost never. But it's fine. It's fine. I love all your suggestions. Give them to me. Um, but someone recommended the good. Oh, you'll like The Good Place because it's a philosophy. It's a show about philosophy. It's about what is goodness, moral philosophy, you could say, and has these four characters on it who are in the good place. Ted Danson is the kind of charge of the good place. It's a secular heaven in a way. The bad place is, of course, the secular version of hell, and they kind of play off this sort of thing. But the question is, I think it's Kristen Bell realizes her character realizes Eleanor that she's there by mistake. She's because you get there by good points. You get there by points, and she's there by mistake, and so she's got to figure out. But she doesn't want to tell that. She doesn't want to admit to that, of course. So she enlists Chidi, a moral philosophy professor, to teach her how to be good. So it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of a Dominican fashion, You sort of like, okay, well, if I take these courses on goodness, then I'll be good. So you know things, and then you can love them. And you wonder if this really works, but it's a complicated show, and it's actually not that bad. It has a philosopher named Todd May, who is a specialist in existential philosophy, and he is the philosophical kind of, well, what would you say, director in the background of this thing. So the philosophy's not bad. It turns out you think it ends up being like utilitarianism by points. Goodness is about like the points you score. It turns out in the end it's actually Kantianism. It's a deontology. So it's like goodness is the intention and the will, the goodwill, regardless of the consequences, ends up being goodness. So I like that. Anyway, the question is, but it asks the right question. I think is that do people care about this? Are people good? Like, what does it mean to be good, and why does this matter? If you ask questions like, are people fast? Are people tall? Are people strong? Like not just individual people, but people. This sort of thing. It doesn't have the same resonance to it because those seem to have like comparatives. So, like, if I ask, Father Jacob Bertrand, are people fast? And what is the response to that? What do you think? Are people fast?
Some,
Some are fast and some aren't fast. Are people
but it is a
tall?
comparative thing. It's, are you fast compared to either standard or
Yeah,
other people?
exactly. It has this kind
Tall,
of
same thing with being tall.
yeah, exactly. And goodness is weird because it's something. Oh well, are people good? And you say, well, let's compare it to. But like fast, you compare to like cheetahs and great white sharks or something. Whereas goodness, well, they're kind of fast in the water. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I don't think that's
goodness,
the first animal people think of, or the second animal when people think of
yeah.
fast animals, sharks.
But
But carry
but
on. Yeah.
goodness, yeah. But goodness is the interesting one because like, well, I mean, are you good? And you think, well, compared to a shark, am I good? It seems like the wrong. In some ways, it seems the right thing. In some ways, it seems the wrong thing. I think that's because, um, the word good is a weird one. I think we use it in so many different ways. It's like the word love, right? So Father Jacob Bridger, what like when you think of good, what do you think of? I mean, we're Dominicans. We want to make distinctions on things. Like, how do you think of the term good?
Yeah, I think well, one of the things that immediately pops into mind with what you're saying is that this comparison of like being fast,
Hmm.
having objectives or compared to others is I think often we when we think about goodness, that's the way people think about are they good? Because you hear, I mean, even in the way we speak, like, oh, I'm not as, there's always this sort of, well, I'm
Hmm.
not as bad as that person, or I didn't do that, or I go to church more than, like, the sort of kind of comparison game, it
Yeah.
creeps into even the question of goodness. But ultimately, that's like when we're talking, when Christ talks about like being perfect, being good, pursuing what is good, when we talk about the virtuous life, we're not talking about as compared to others. We're talking about like there's an objective reality, an objective
Mm.
thing, we could say, in which that constitutes human flourishing. Like there are things that constitute human flourishing. Super easy example, like being a charitable person rather than being like an uncharitable person, or like not murdering people is like constitutes like in a way human flourishing. So there are objective standards, and it's this that we want to draw like our attention to. And when we're talking about are people good, it's not as compared to others, it's not like a grading scale, but is there something that we are pursuing, like goodness itself ultimately? So with that, like we can talk
Mm,
about, perhaps
yeah.
it's worth talking about, like what is goodness then? What
Yeah.
is the thing, right? And there are different ways or different kind of accounts that we can, like
Yeah.
different ways by which to approach that question, from whatever. There's sort of, like, we can start very simply, very basically, about like with what we could call like an ontological reality. The question of, if you look at the book of Genesis, God creates and he says it's good thing, his creation is good, and some of it happens to be very good even. um but that kind of raises the question, or the reality that, like, things existing are good. Things have a goodness in the very fact that they are. So to exist has some sort of goodness attached to it. So that's maybe a foundational way to start, maybe a basic way to
Yeah.
start, but at least a place to start. There are, of course, other ways. What are some other ways that, I mean, getting more towards the question of like goodness with respect to like virtue and that sort of thing? Obviously, just being doesn't mean you're a virtuous thing. A rock isn't virtuous, but it's also not vicious. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do we kind of
Well,
move towards that?
no, that's definitely right. That the first thing you need to base it is that everything that exists is good because God doesn't make like pure evil things. God, we might go, oh no, I made this thing, now it's it's evil. Whoops, I made a mistake. But God can't think in that. God doesn't work in that way. So anything that exists that He makes is good at some level, and we might say that because it's a desirable thing. It's loved by Him into being by some in some fashion. So, but then of course things fail and things they aren't perfectly good, we could say, because there's also this, you could say, like a natural goodness. And I don't mean like natural versus supernatural goodness, but I mean like natural in the sense of the nature of something, what it's for. So you can think of the ontological goodness as like its base level. So it's just kind of its being, just there, which is good, because if it wasn't good, it wouldn't be there, because God sustains everything. Nothing has its own being. He gives it. But then what is it for? He created it for something. It's supposed to do something. And then you get this goodness, as Father Jacob Bertrand talked about, with like fulfillment. So we talk about perfection. These are words that are related to goodness. Fulfillment. There's something aiming towards something. And so a good thing is something that is good for something. So a good knife is good for cutting. A good coffee maker is for making good coffee. It sounds trivial, but it's an important point that there are things in the world that are intended for particular ends we talk about. And the good is related to that end. So if we want to say, are people good? That's where we start to bring this question of, not, as Father Jacob Bertrand said, comparison, like, am I better than this person per se? But what are you for? Like, what does it mean to be a good human being? And not sense of, well, I exist, therefore I'm a good human being, but more than that, am I good as a human being? And that has basic biological functioning, which has a sort of speed. So if you can't run the mile in under 13 minutes or something, you might you might say, well, I'm not a good natural human being, you could say, or something, or biological human being. Or if you have, sickness, we get the sense of, that's a badness, but it's not a moral evil. It's just in the sense for you, now I'm sick. Oh, now I'm bad. No, but you're not a fully perfect human being. And then moral goodness we could talk about is like the will and the desire, so the kind of freedom involved in choosing to do and to love certain things, uh, which animals don't have the capacity for. So animals are good. A good squirrel is a squirrel that does things well, squirrel things well. But he's not morally good. We don't give him trophies, moral trophies. We don't give people moral trophies either. In fact, it's usually the opposite, right? If you're morally bad today, you get money and stuff. But anyway, we'll put that as a side point out, that we as humans have this natural goodness, you could say, this goodness of our nature, and then we have this moral goodness, which is a development of that nature by reason and will. And so when we talk about, are people good, what we mean by that is not like, are people comparatively good to other people, but are people capable of being good? Are we made for goodness, and can we achieve it, and what that would look like?
Yeah, and that moral goodness is, I think, where, at least in, yeah, it's a place where we often think about, are people good. Like that's usually or often, maybe not usually, maybe that's not fair, but often the kind of the
Yeah.
terminus of what of our consideration with goodness. Do people like behave well? Is there a moral goodness? And now obviously there's within the realm of faith and Christianity, there are things that constitute like moral goodness, and people who aren't Christian have different opinions as to what that is. But I think we can say, broadly speaking, that that's where people kind of consider the goodness of a person, whatever kind of standards for morality, but then
Hmm.
you live up to those standards of
Yeah.
morality. But for in the Christian mind, and perhaps is really at heart for us, and really for everybody, whether Christian or not, but for our conversation too, is this is a further sort of category of goodness, but this idea of supernatural goodness. And I think it's differentiated from just moral goodness as with respect to like what it's aimed at. Father Bonaventure
Hmm.
mentioned ends. What is the end of moral goodness? Well, it's to like be a prudent person. What is the end of moral goodness with respect to fortitude? Well, to be a courageous person. But with respect to the supernatural reality, well, what's the end of that? Well, it's God. To live for and with God. So even those moral categories of prudence or fortitude, when the supernatural is involved, when grace is
Hmm.
involved, they're ordered in their particular ways to God, to live in accord with how God has created us to live, to be holy, to share in God's life. So though they might have the same sort of like prudence we might talk about in a sort of non supernatural and a supernatural way, or obviously
Hmm.
faith, hope, and charity only have to do with the supernatural. um they do, and this is kind of the beauty of how we've been created, that we can do human things, we can do human moral actions that redound to the glory of God and to our sanctification. So yeah, here I think this is really like, are human beings good? Are they working towards, are they moving towards, cooperating with grace towards their final end
Hmm.
of union with
Yes.
God? So like therein lies the question, I think, right? So can we talk about like, are
Eternally
are
good. Yeah.
people good? Are we good? Are we able to do that? And if we look, I guess we can divide the argument into like a hopeful, yeah, we're great, we're doing it, and like a yikes, I don't know, let's look at the world around us, it doesn't seem like that's happening. So a sort of like pessimistic, optimistic dichotomy,
Yeah.
maybe.
That's no. That seems right. I mean, most things break into binaries in some fashion. It
Yeah.
seems like as a structural principle. Um, but I'll just say, dear listeners, Father Jacob Bertrand has like hit a tripwire on massive 20th century debates about, of course. Now hold on a second. Do we have a natural? Isn't our natural goodness just an end towards God? So what is the difference between supernature and nature? And Henri de Lubac shows up here, and Garrigou-Lagrange shows up, and you have like extrinsicus and intrinsicus on grace. So if you are in this kind of circle, if you think, wait a minute, how can you separate moral goodness from supernatural goodness? You'll notice that there is a continuity here, even from the ontological, that you be, but you're being something, to the natural, to the moral, to the supernatural. So it is, we'll just say that this is a complicated topic, of course, where there's two ends of man, one end of man, blah, blah, blah. And maybe we'll do an episode on that. But it's important to see the continuities that Father Jacob Bridger talked about, is when he says related to God, well, as a human being, you're also related to God. But in the supernatural way, it's even elevated. Thomas talks about not just healing our natures, but also elevating us to participate with the life of the Trinity, which is beyond mere human, you could say, prudence, but as a supernatural, the gift of faith and love, hope and love. So it's important to realize that there's these different theological and natural levels, but they're also related to each other. Dulubac and Garrigou-Lagrange are both right. Whatever, we'll talk about that later.
Probably
But
not,
you
but
could say, yeah, exactly. But you could say that it seems like there are two traditional yes or no, sic et non things here. There's pessimism, like, are we? Yeah, are we good? Are we capable of loving God and being good people, and not in the spiritual and the natural sense? And you can say the pessimistic answer is the kind of Augustinian, although caveat, Calvinist Protestant view of, no, of course not. Since the fall, we've been totally depraved, and grace and God's kind of mechanical, I'm showing my hand on this, puppeteering, is the only thing that lets us be good. So that the world is kind of a war of all against all. We're just the worst people in the world, and and God is the one who grabs us out of this, and He's the one who gives us all of the good things, such that you might find someone who, when you congratulate them on doing something well, and they say, "Well, by the grace of God goeth I." It's on that. Don't congratulate me. It's not my work. And then you have the other side, I suppose, is the kind of, and you might be. I think these are more like, uh, I guess, persuasions, you could say, or styles, or base camps. The other side would be like the optimistic kind of secular enlightenment. All these are all in quotations because there's more to say about them. Move. This is like Rousseau and the natural savages that actually know we are naturally good, and it's like civilization and Christianity and other things that corrupt us. But naturally, we are good, and we have the ability to be good, and we can actually get all the way up to God in these things. This is the heresy, you could say, of Pelagianism, although of course Pelagius is a little more complicated than that. But the idea that you can, yeah, we know the fall wasn't that bad. I mean, sure, I tripped, but we're back up, a little bruise on the knees, but we can still run right to Him. And the only reason we don't is because of our own goodness. So there's like a pessimism, you could say Augustinianism aspect, and then there's a Pelagian kind of optimism thing. And I suspect that the two of us, Father Jacob Bertrand and I, probably come down in probably a little bit shaded on the pessimism side, which is not a bad thing because, well, is that true, Father Jacob Bertrand? If between these two, what do you make of them?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that the optimistic, I mean, evidence seems to the contrary with respect to the optimistic kind of side of things. I guess this in the sort of Catholic mind, I guess that I've been formed by, obviously, there's a sort of, I think, kind of falls with the pessimistic but kind
Mm,
of category.
yeah, nice.
If we can create a
Let's do that.
third category, like pessimistic,
Aufhebung, yeah, synthesis.
I, yeah, a pessimistic but, like, yes, the fall has hurt us pretty badly. Sin hurts us. Sin has corrupted us in some pretty serious ways. But and our hope of climbing out of that on our own terms, on sort of a natural level, is zero. We can't do that. Hence, like, God, hence, or the incarnation, hence Christ. Like, again, the history and evidence points to the contrary of our ability to climb out. So, but there is a savior. So it's pessimistic but like, it's a big one, because Christ is, that's a pretty big kind of entry on the scene. So yeah, I think like, if we look at St. Thomas, it's kind of as our guide here, it's a balanced answer. We can are people good? We can be. So we're good as much as we exist, and we're made for the good, the ultimate supernatural good. So if that's, those things being the case, and the whole host of other realities in between, again, the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, grace, all of that, I think the answer is we can be. And there ought to be real hope that we can be good. And this is sort of the Thomistic line, right? That there's a sort of pessimism that without God, like, we're lost. And this is not just St. Thomas. This comes from Christ himself, that without
Yeah.
God, we can do nothing. But the reality of grace, and this is where I think it's kind of why I was kind of hemming and hawing, because I think it's easy to put a lot of stock in this sort of, we're broken, we're fallen. But we often don't put enough stock, I think, in, like, the power of grace and mercy, and the transformative and elevating
Ooh,
reality
elevative.
of grace, as you mentioned earlier in the episode, that, like, those things are more real than more real than our sin. And they win if we but cooperate, and if we but live with Christ and pursue virtue and goodness, and cooperate with his grace. So yeah, we can be. It's not a sort of just like, maybe one day, but, like, the offer's real. The offer's real. And the offer's real because, like, the fall is real. So it's kind of I don't think it's easy to just say, like, to park ourselves, or it's not easy for me to park myself in one camp or the other,
Yeah.
because of everything that I've just kind of walked
Well,
through.
I think maybe the problem is be a difference between a static view and a dynamic view. And I think you're right to point out that the pessimism and optimism, the kind of Calvinist version and the Pelagian version, you could say, is they're static views. So it has a question of, like, are people good? No. And that's just what by nature they're just not good anymore, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sort of blah blah blah. And it has this kind of static quality to it. And same thing with the pessimist or the secularist view, where it's like, no, people are just naturally, they're just good. Like, doesn't make sense to not say that. Now, are we getting better, this sort of thing? But yeah, we're all capable of goodness. That's just intrinsic. But taking it from a dynamic viewpoint, as you say, can we? So in modal terms, like, is it possible? Which means we've got moving from potency to act, something that's could be done. Um, that brings it out as more of a question of dynamic change, potentiality, of possibilities, such that you could say yes and no in a way. Yes, we are good because we have the possibilities through our nature still of responding to good actions, but also especially because of grace. And our natures are, in a sense, fitted. As bizarre, again, this is the nature grace paradox. Our natures are fitted for grace. We're meant to have the grace of Christ in our lives to do good human acts and not just good religious acts, you could say. So are we good? We might not be good as we are or can be at this moment. No, but we are capable, yes, because our natures are not fundamentally broken. We haven't turned into squids or something. We're still human beings, which are meant for God, and therefore we can be good. So it's a question. So it's a. I like that in yes, but or no, but kind of a thing. When you have a dynamic view, which brings it to the personal in the sense of, as opposed to like, are people good? Are our planet's fast or whatever or anything. It's not a scientific question. It's now a moral question about, am I good? Am I good? You know?
Yeah. And I think in the conversation about like, are people good and that sort of thing, we don't want to, we didn't really at least explicitly say this, but it's worth saying. I think it's not a sort of like way by which this conversation or this question is not a way by which to sort of like what pass like judgment on people's eternal soul, like go out in the world, everybody's bad and everybody's going to, like, that's not what we're talking about really. But like this as I think Father Bonaventure put it succinctly and well, this sort of like this dynamism that like we're created in a particular way for a particular thing, each of us to to know God, to love God, to share in his life. And goodness is a question of like, are we in pursuit of that, and can we be in pursuit of that? And the answer is yes, we can be, but in the end, God doesn't force us into that. We're free in that. So there's that's really, I think, like the question there is like, are we pursuing goodness in a way? Like, is that, I think it's on offer. It's certainly not on offer by our own efforts, but it certainly is on offer in Christ. And then it's sort of a question of like, okay, well, what does that look like and how do we pursue it? And this is the whole point of like the virtuous life of living that in our lives, of living the Christian life, of being formed and transformed by his grace. So I guess the question sort of is like, well, how are we, like, how do we do that? So in the last, we have just a couple of minutes left, but like the question of how do we do that then is still on offer, or it's still something to be addressed. Like, is it simply, which oftentimes, and in not for good, but like the faith can be boiled down to sort of like moralism of like, here's the rules, you follow these 10 commandments, you're a good person. Well, like, maybe not. I don't know if just like following the 10 commandments is the apex, is the climax of human flourishing. It's certainly the foundation of it, but is that really the climax of it? I don't know. What
Well,
do you
that's
think there, like,
no.
to
Again,
sort
I
of
mean,
wrap that up?
yeah, it's good that, again, just we talked about going from static to dynamic. We could talk about extrinsic to intrinsic kind of goodness. Such that we've been talking about goodness in the sense of not external criteria, but internal criteria to the perfection of the person, and obviously the perfection of the person to God. In that, and in the same way, being good, following rules, you could say, being necessary to being good, doing good things, bodily actions that are good, necessary, but not sufficient, in that it's the internal. These are externals, but the internals, the principles, are you internally developing as a good person? Not in the sense of like, my internal thoughts are good, but my actions are bad. I'm throwing kittens off of giant buildings, but internally I'm loving God. But that my internal principles, I have the virtuous life in the sense that I naturally am courageous. I'm naturally am temperate. That these, and not just from externals, like I know I'm not supposed to drink, this much, but that I don't desire to drink this much. I know I'm supposed to help this person here in this case, but I feel impulse internally from this thing. That's the goodness is about the renewing of ourselves, our natures, both in the moral plane and the average everyday secular natural plane, which really isn't average everyday secular because of the incarnation. Because the supernatural plane, when Christ says, have you done these things to me? Have you done these things when I was sick, when I was naked, when I was in prison, this sort of thing? And I don't think he doesn't mean external, like, yeah, I did these things, man, I hated doing those things, and I was thinking about other stuff all the time, and I just got lucky. But like, I wanted to do those things, and when I had the opportunity, I did those things. That's what goodness is has to start in, is the healing and elevating of our natural reason and love and capacities. And that's good because we have reason and will and natural capacities and desires. And so the base is there to be good, to be renewed, and continue to be perfected, be as perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. But at the same time, to know that this is by grace, and this is where all the sacraments and prayers especially come in, that we can work with God because He wants us to work with Him.
Perfect. Well, there you have it. Are people good? Hope so. I think so. By God's grace. Possible. Very possible. And yeah, the beautiful thing, I guess, of the reality of the incarnation, Christ's grace that He offers us to share in His own life, that for which we were made. So there you have it. I guess a question to continue to ponder. Maybe not, but perhaps. So thanks to all of our supporters. If you'd like to help out with the work of the podcast, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/Godsplaining and consider making a monthly donation. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, like, subscribe, leave a review. All of those things help us out tremendously. So thanks for doing that. Thanks for taking a second to do that. Visit godsplaining.org to shop our merchandise, to get dates and information for upcoming Godsplaining events. We have our few retreats, 2 in July, 1 in August. Spots are filling up quickly. So if you'd like to get on a retreat this summer, do something like that, check that out. We'd love to have you. And as always, thanks for praying for us. We will be sure to keep you in our prayers. And until next time, God bless.